So welcome, friends, to our very first talk of the new season. I am extremely excited to welcome a dear old friend of mine who has been with me on the journey into the study of multi-species entanglements since before I even heard of that phrase. In fact, they were one of the people who introduced me to the concept of multi-species work in the first place. Ciclón Olivares, it's a huge honor to have you kicking off our speaker series tonight. Now, I'm going to just do a brief introduction, and then I will hand the floor over to you. So everybody, tonight we have something really exciting in store. Ciclón, who is both a scholar, a storyteller, a teacher at Pratt, an artist, wearer of many glorious hats, is going to provide us with a talk that has a video component. They have asked me to make an empathic warning, which we posted, but I'm going to say it again. There are images of animals that have been hit by cars and are in states of quite awful mortal woundedness and death. So for anyone for whom that is too upsetting or painful, trigger warning ahead. Feel free to close your eyes, look away if you need to. I do think that those of us who can bear witness to the world that human infrastructure, our way of life, and our dominant modes of being human have made, looking at these really painful images can be an important starting point in bearing witness to the larger kind of problems that we're making in the world. So this is the warning to be ready if you can't handle looking at maimed and dead animals. There's also a trigger warning just in case anyone has epilepsy. There is a pulsating, strobing visual effect for the first few minutes in the beginning. So if you have ever had an epileptic seizure, or if you feel uncomfortable, dizzy, or whatever, just close your eyes as Ciclón's video is introducing the talk and giving their gratitude. And then there is also a soundscape, which is intended to create a kind of sensory overload. And for some people, again, it may be too much for them. You are free to mute the mic for a few minutes or mute the sound for a few minutes if you need to. Don't leave if it's bothering. It's not going to last very long. And it's part of the sensory experience that Ciclón is offering us tonight. So this new season, the AMOR MUNDI Multispecies Ecological Worldmaking Lab, working with the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development and the Integrative Center for Humanities Innovation at Chiang Mai University. Our lab is initiating the new series of the year called Seeking Symbiopoeisis with the More Than Human. And for those of you for whom English is not your native language and you haven't taken my classes, symbiopoeisis is more than symbiosis, living with, but poiesis also contains the poetic and the making. And it's really a nod to world making processes that are both ideational and cultural, but also biological and natural. In other words, we don't believe in the nature-culture dualist hierarchical division that much of modern life is founded on pretending exists. So this is a nod to that, and the beginning of a set of conversations with scholars from social sciences, environmental humanities, from the natural scientists like biologists and ecologists. It includes artists and curators. It includes people who are working in the humanities and literature and philosophy and cultural studies and much more. We are an organization that is dedicated to trying to create a platform in the global South where many of the harms of the Anthropocene or Anthroposupremacene, as I like to call it, or the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene or the Cthulhucene or the Necrocene, as Ciclón is invoking, where many of the harms of this new era, whatever we call it, are disproportionately born and felt by the people who live in this part of the world, especially marginalized people, especially women, people of color, indigenous people, and so forth. Okay, so yeah, our lab, it's an intersectional multidisciplinary research initiative that is investigating how human and more than human world making and survival are inextricably and mutually entangled. And our aim is to grow a knowledge making community by fostering dialogues and collaborations. Everyone who is not a speaker, please stop your videos. Thank you so much. So we are here to try to foster dialogues and collaborations across many disciplines. And hopefully in the process of doing that, we'll make new friends for the end of this world and hopefully the building of a better one. So I'd like to just briefly introduce our speakers, but before I do, because people are still joining, we have some little housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic, please turn off your video for the duration until we have Q&A and you're ready to ask a question, in which time it's fine to turn on your video, but otherwise it gets confusing on the screen and it's hard to manage. So thank you for your help with that. And again, for the trigger warning for those who just joined, there is some painful stuff to look at, and be ready to close your eyes if you need to. Don't just leave. So quantum constellations, casting a circle of protection in the Necrocene, is a talk by multi-species storyteller and transmedia storyteller and researcher Ciclón Olivares. And there's going to be a roundtable discussion with Oliver Kellhammer and Margaretha Haughwout, which will be moderated by me and full of hopefully lots of exciting provocations and questions from you folks in the audience. Briefly, I'm not going to read the entire bio because it's there on Eventbrite, it's there on Facebook, but Ciclón Olivares is a very special person to me because they are the person who introduced me to the concept of multi-species. We met at the House of World Culture in Berlin as part of the second Anthropocene campus in 2016. Can someone let the people in the waiting room in, please? Thank you. So since then, our intellectual journeys have been very much intertwined. And so Ciclón, who is also known as Lisette T. Olivares, is the co-founder of Sin Cabeza Production. I don't speak Spanish, sorry to butcher that. And SK Symbiotic, which are transmedia research platforms that collaborate with life forms within and beyond the technosphere. Okay, and their work engages conceptual activisms and develops technologies of consciousness that contend with conflicted affects of Terran, that is earthly, pleasure and strife amid mass extinctions. They have conducted in situ multi-species ethnography in China, India, Chile, Germany, and the US, including documentary, filmmaking, multi-species architecture, video art, and been a part of many academic conferences and important art exhibitions, including the Donna Haraway multi-species writing on coevolution, Worldly House at Documenta 13, and many, many more prestigious international art exhibitions. And their writing has been published in many, many places. They also teach currently at the Pratt Institute, and they are now living since 2018 and creating SK Symbiotic in a haunted 18th century Georgian stone house that reveals the complex histories about the site's myriad beings. Ciclón is currently interested in genetically modified mosquitoes and blightocysts, witchcraft in pre-revolutionary America, and in promoting widespread commitment to multi-species communities, especially those that dwell in your backyard. Okay, I will also introduce our roundtable speakers after the talk, when we are about to start the roundtable. For new people, please turn off your video and your microphone. And for the person managing all of that, sorry to have you keep having to do that, but that's how we're going to make this a pleasurable pleasurable experience. Okay, people still keep coming in late. Maybe, wait, can you put in the chat the house rules so that when the people come in, they know? That would be wonderful. Okay. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is hand the floor over to Ciclón Olivares. And for those of you who don't know me, sorry, I'm so rude. Not everybody knows me. I am Maya Kóvskaya. I also go by Stella, which is my grandmother's name. And my students in Thailand recently named me Mao, which is, you might guess, means cat, because one of my multi-species kin are cats. So Ciclón, I would like to call you to the floor. And I will turn off my video. Everyone else, videos and microphones off, please, for the duration. I'm going to turn off my video. And Ciclón, you can start screen sharing. And yeah, again, if you have epilepsy, you might want to close your eyes during the gratitude part of this for the first 2 or 3 minutes. I don't want to cause anyone to have a seizure, but without further ado, I hand over the floor to Ciclón Olivares.
Everyone, thank you so much for being here. It is a huge honor to see all of you in this event here in the shared space together. I'm so compelled by your presence. Thank you. Without further ado, I am going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to mute myself. And if there's any problem with sound or transmission, please make a gesture or something so that I can tell. Thank you.
I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the care that I have received and that makes it possible to be present with all of you here. In this time space now that is tethered to time spaces of the past and future, I would like to thank the founder of AMOR MUNDI Ecological Worldmaking Lab, Stella, or as I call them, Maya Kóvskaya. In particular, I would like to thank them for the trust they were willing to impart to me and to give me this chance to speak here today, and for the extraordinary energy that it took them to bring all of us here together despite tragedy, mourning, and loss that have been present at each stage of the preparation for this event today. I would very much like to thank Ariya Tiva Suradej, the lab manager, who has made me feel seen and welcome in each interaction we've had together since AMOR MUNDI's events began. I would like to thank those who are responsible for supporting the production of this space, for the labor they contributed in order to develop this conversation today. Thank you, Pietro de Castro. Thank you, Blake Palmer. I would also like to thank our institutional hosts who have provided Kóvskaya with the infrastructure and community so vital to enabling the hard work of philosophy tinged with love. Thanks to Chiang Mai University, RCSD, and ICHI. To the faculty, to the staff, to the students, and to those in the virtual commons who collaborate to make the world a place for interconnections. I'm so thankful to all of you. Sawadee Kap. Sawadee Ka. Thank you to the cyanobacteria who have given me air, to the sky and the clouds for the world above, to the stones who teach me to listen and to learn from their silence, to the rivers, to the streams, to the lakes, to the oceans, to the seas, to the thermal vents, for the wet that makes up so much of my body. Thank you to the lichen and the trees and the tardigrades, to the moss and the mud and the mosquitoes, to the flies, to the invertebrates, to the mammals. Thank you, rain. Thank you, petrichor. Thank you, geosemin. Thank you, streptomyx. Praise for the rainbow. Thank you, ground, for your strength. Thank you, lightning, for your charge. Thank you, cyclone, for your spiral. Thank you, volcano. Thank you, magma. Thank you, sun. Thank you, moon. Thank you, stars. Thank you, antimatter. Thank you, black holes. Thank you, planets. Thank you, galaxies. Thanks to all of you, my ancestors, for your whispers and for the dreams. Have you ever lost someone that you love dearly? The ground shifts and leaves you imbalanced when the living spirit transitions. There is an uncanny disbelief, a penetrating sense of the unreal, of the unheimlich, of having slipped into a world that looks the same, but that is a mirror image, a simulacra of the world you once recognized as your own. You see, there is a part of you that goes through that portal with your loved one. There is a piece of you that goes missing with that death, and that portal pulls you towards another place. You can feel its centrifugal force. It opens with the departure of your beloved. Healers are trained to find those portals and to navigate across them. It's rainy here. The glass is cold. Winter doesn't want to recede yet. But as I look outside, I'm excited to see a cardinal with brown feathers and a red mohawk moving sprightly amidst the wayward branches of the bright yellow forsythia shrubs. April is ending and the bounty of sunshine and warmth has yet to reach us in that vast valley beyond the panes. I am tired of the damp cold, which weighs within my lungs and forces me to labor for breath during the night when the air is colder. I feel vulnerable to the invisible virus that looms beyond the glass. As I press the palms of my hand to the window, I unexpectedly travel through a portal of time and space. I'm 5 years old, and I am in the kitchen of the first house I ever lived in, the suburbs of New Jersey. At that age, I am accustomed to being confined to the inside for most of the year because of my lungs, which have been weak since before I can remember, disabled by the dirty air of my birth town, Elizabeth, where the industrial manufacturer GM pumps pollutants into the sky, a source of income for my father, who works in an auto assembly factory during my early life. I am not a child who loves playing outside. I am the kind who reads and watches TV from the safety of the domestic interior, but I enjoy gazing at the world beyond from the safety of the kitchen. As I look out, I see wild exotic animals, giraffes, elephants, a cheetah, deer and gazelles, and a wolf run past me in the backyard. Was it a fantasy? Was it an apparition? A fold in time? A premonition of the Sixth Great Extinction event that compels me so today? As I lean into the wormhole, my hands search for the impressions made by the smaller prints of my 5-year-old self, and I caress her through the condensed moisture of skin and warmth against glass, comforting us both. In 2021, I commemorated 10 years of continuous mourning with the action of shaving my head on Luke's death anniversary. This work also marks the transition of my gendered species being and puts forward an intentionality and commitment to transform the enduring hurt by becoming a healer. Not long after this performance, I learned again that sadness transcends logic and time space, and that in its spiral movement, it can strike you exponentially hard over and over again. The departure of our loved ones from Terra can be amplified, multiplied, in a type of tragic math that exceeds comprehension. On September 8th, and again on February 27th, I lost 2 life companions. Today, it has been exactly 1 year since the first death. Not a coincidence, a quantum connectivity from many. All of this during a period when millions of people and creatures worldwide have also lost too many of their beloveds. I'm speaking of COVID, of course, but I am also speaking of all the intersectional infirmities that are exacerbated in the Necrocene, and that are going to keep striking with tsunami, earthquake, cyclone severity. In my own inner circle, those closest to me were also subject to this cruel exponential mourning. I learned from Alexis Pauline Gumbs that it is important to invoke a specific being when one begins to write. Dedication as ritual, to bring them in close, to hold them near, to draw strength from that kinship as you lean into the precipice of writing. And so I would like to dedicate this lecture to Lucian O'Connor, my queer sibling whose love taught me to trust my voice, to Prabha Pilar for her distributed intelligence, the abundance of queer corn utopias, and for recognizing me in the eye of the storm, to Uta Horner for her psychic telekinesis with taxidermied animals and confined octopuses, and for vital support in my trans-animal corporeal transitions, and to Cheto Castellano for initiating me in revolutionary multi-species becoming. All of you have had to endure an excess of death in the past year. All of you keep me amongst the living with your multi-species ethos and care. This talk extends its circle of protection also to those who have been lost this past year, in particular those I knew and who have departed, to Loki, el gato con botas, to Minnie, el perrito gordo, to Fina, to Bella, to Theo, to Nina, to Stelita Segovia, to Paolo Gerardino, to Anne Spaliro, to Silvita, and to all of us Terrans who must bear witness to the Thanatocene. It is for you that I sing. Tú no tienes la culpa, mi amor, que todo sea tan feo. Tú no tienes la culpa, mi amor, de tanto tiroteo. Vas por la calle cantando lágrimas de oro. Vas por la calle brotando lágrimas de oro. I was walking my companion Matzia as I always do in the mornings, and in the afternoons, and in the evenings. But on this particular Saturday morning walk, I was trying to figure out how to begin this presentation. The question was not only conceptual, but formal. How might I cast a circle around myself and my audience, given the technological characteristics of our shared virtual space? Would I need to craft an animation to create this special effect? Should I create a circle out of golden thread? But where would I construct that? And how long would it take to produce? Just as I was trying to imagine a techno fix to my visual metaphorical problem, I realized I was about to walk headfirst into a sticky spider web replete with its maker busy at work, doing precisely what I was conceptualizing and stressing over. She was creating a precisely woven circle. Despite Matsia's insistence on continuing ahead to the cloud trail, I stopped to take in the message. This is an example of a quantum connectivity, a material semiotics emitted from the pluriverse, which I build upon from the work of Deborah Bird-Rose and others. I have grown accustomed to this language over the years, and hence my ability to read the circular web and its invertebrate witch as signifier. I stopped to take in the scene and to marvel at the weaving and craft making before me. The spider's top segment consisted of 8 arms in contrasting shades of brown that glowed to appear red with the sunlight. Her bottom half displayed spikes that jutted out as if she were carrying a speckled star on her derriere. As I angled backwards with my mobile phone camera in an attempt to record our encounter, the silk of the web caught the light rays that filtered in through the black oak leaves above, creating a prism that would reflect greens, blues, purples, and magentas from each perfect segment that she drew with her body. From this astral carrier bag, she would eject the thread to continue the pattern she was constructing. Each pull from her star allowed the light to create a rainbow reflection that I struggled to catch clearly through the prosthetic eye preferred by my companion camera. I was able to watch her for at least 8 minutes until Matsia's high-pitched whistle insisted that we continue on our walk. What was interesting to me about looking at the Margaretha from my tall and trichromatic umwelt, a concept that I learned about from Ed Yong in his recent book, An Immense World, and which he learned from Jacob von Uexküll, was not interesting to Matsia below, who was much more intent on pursuing a cognitive mapping of the site through her highly developed vomeronasal organ, which senses the world in a vastly different register than I am equipped to share. And you can read also about this in Ed Yong's book. What I realized was that I didn't know enough about this spider and how she sensed our shared world. When I got home, I was able to consult the Oracle of Google to ask about this person I encountered on the trail. Keywords like spikes and circular web led me to her scientific name, the arrow-shaped Margaretha spider, also known as an orb spinner, an invertebrate and arachnid whose ancestors have been present on Terra for over 400 million years. The chain of signification grew. I was piqued by her name. I had a vague remembrance of Athena's mythos, but I decided that such a memorable and significant encounter with an arachnid goddess deserved a refresh. Athena was the daughter of Zeus, spilled onto the earth without a mother, emerging fully grown from the forehead of the most powerful god in Mount Olympus. Her royal superiority amongst the gods and the great love of her father transformed her into an impenetrable entity who was protected from rape and domination despite her penchant for war. Though adored in many cities, her name persists in Athens. She was a goddess of crafts and recognized widely for her art of spinning and weaving, skills which became affiliated with wisdom, righteousness, and practical reason. She was loyal to the powers of the gods of Olympus and was celebrated as an excellent weaver. Yet Athena was not always so rational, or perhaps she was too rational. When Arachne challenged Athena to a competition to measure their skill in weaving, She produced a tapestry that was the opposite in its representational thematics. Whereas Athena depicted the epic power of the gods, Arachne showed their debauchery. Such was Athena's anger, and perhaps also jealousy, that she destroyed Arachne's work. Arachne was so distraught by the critical reception of her cheeky work that she attempted suicide by hanging. Athena took pity upon Arachne, and in a magical transfiguration, the noose became the thread of a cobweb and Arachne a spider. Though the arrow-shaped Macrothena I encountered is named after Athena, who in Greek mythology is responsible for the creation of all arachnids, I would nonetheless like to honor Arachne and her skilled but misunderstood art practice that sought to challenge the gods. Let us turn then to the creatures on earth who have sought to assert themselves at the top of Terran hierarchy. Let us enter the portal made by this orb spider to consider the abolition of the human.
I encountered this black bear on my way to a Latinx grocery store in Hackettstown via Route 80 East. I normally don't stop to take photographs of animals on large interstate highways because of the risk Amatzia and I run of getting struck by another vehicle traveling at high speed. However, this was the first time I ever encountered a black bear discarded on the shoulder of the road. I could not help but be pierced by the scene, even as it whirred past quickly with the speed of my vehicle. I made the decision to take the next exit and to return to the highway again, this time in pursuit of an encounter with this dead bear. This made it possible for me to stop my car safely on the interstate road. My body trembles each time I stop for an encounter. I feel an adrenaline rush that alerts me of danger and impending sadness. I knew that I could easily receive a ticket from state troopers for my intentional witnessing. Despite my training in wildlife rehabilitation, I am not on the New Jersey Registry of Rehabilitators, and my use of a camera to document the scene often draws attention from passers-by. That attention is not always positive. I felt compelled to see this bear. I felt the responsibility to act as a witness to their violent death. I wonder what type of vehicle may have had the impact. Was it a truck carrying goods like those I was on the way to pick up? Was it a person traveling to work early in the morning? Surely it was a mistake. The bear was likely traveling during the crepuscular hours when the darkness of the sky protects wildlife from the movement and gaze of the dominant dwellers. But on this morning, the darkness of the sky and the camouflage offered by their dark-brown fur created the opportunity for their impactful death. It hurt to stop and watch this bear. I wondered if it was kindred to the black bears who roam the limited unbuilt space in my neighborhood. I wondered if they belonged to the clan of black bears who use the defunct railroad corridor behind my home and who have lived in this territory for over 20 million years. Even if this bear is not one of those who resides in close proximity to my home, I nonetheless recognized this bear as a neighbor. In this act of witnessing, I could not help but feel that this black bear was also my kin. Alexis Pauline Gumbs helped me to find hope and purpose in the midst of the layered despair caused by racist, ableist, extractive, normative, heteropatriarchal, universal, colonial capitalism, and the global spread of COVID. Her book Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, is kindred in this conversation. In her experimentally written multispecies ethnography, she turns to the ocean and its creatures for inspiration, in particular mammals, and a few fish. Gumbs, who is a student and scholar of the Black radical tradition, describes an empathic connection between animals and activists that transforms her readers. But don't take my word for it. This is what emergent strategy activist Adrienne Marie Brown writes in the foreword. When Alexis first started posting these marine mammal missives, I thought, oh, emergent strategy from the deep. This is a whole realm of the wild world that I've barely gotten to learn from, and that has a huge amount to teach us right now on how we survive, how we slow down, how we make the air last, how we avoid predation and extinction, how we play. I have always felt myself to be a child of the ocean, but like many black humans, the lines that tether me to distinct earth and water were cut long ago. With Undrowned, Alexis offers back to us a set of ancestors, sibling species, a variety of solidarities that can teach me about myself. I didn't know I had so much blackness in common with the marine mammal world. This text feels like meeting an eccentric and wise and intriguing family. Early on in her text, Gumbs unsettles the traditional way of conducting multispecies ethnography. Her feminist body is always centered and available in the text, in contradistinction to so many of the conventional and purportedly neutral scientific writings that are available to us as researchers of animals. Gums establishes kinship with the rest of mammalian life in her introduction, without depoliticizing the specificity of her experience on Earth as a woman of color, asserting, "I identify as a mammal. I identify as a black woman ascending with and shaped by a whole group of people who were transubstantiated into property and kidnapped across an ocean." Yet it is her grand poetic intervention that I ask us to consider as we return to this black bear who was exterminated on the side of the highway. Gums explains, "My hope is to move from identification, also known as that process with which we say what is what, like which dolphin is that over there, and what are its properties, to identification, that process through which we expand our empathy, and the boundaries of who we are become more fluid, because we identify with the experience of someone different, maybe someone of a whole different so-called species." For Gums, this is a difficult task. She clarifies that she is not collapsing the experience of marine mammals into a paradigm of equality with black subjectivity, but that her objective is to undo a definition of the human, which she explains is so tangled in separation and domination that it is consistently making our lives incompatible with the planet. Instead, Gums proposes the exercise of identifying with, an emergent strategy that interrogates both the self and the reader, to ask, what may be possible? It is in response to Gums' question, how can we listen across species, across extinction, across harm, and her assertion, blackness is more expensive than the human, that I dare to ask, as I keep this extermination scene in tow, how might Black, Indigenous people of color, BIPOC, be intersectionally expanded by the inclusion of this and all of Lenapehoeking's black bears? How might we think of the violence aimed at Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other marginal and non-normative bodies on the roadways of New Jersey in relation to this scene of black bear extermination?
Audiovisual composition by Sarama Sound that we just viewed, and that I'd like to use as a transition in our intersectional discussion, there is a conscientious juxtaposition of buffalo herds and scenery from aboard a train. Black and white found footage of buffaloes on the plains are spliced with blurry scenes of women working on an assembly line, abstract imagery that reveals railroad tracks, white picket fences, and later, crowds of people exiting from trains in what appears to be a cityscape. The noise is crafted with instruments that are often used by healers across diverse faith traditions, from the Jewish harp commonly used by Siberian shamans, the site from where this translation term comes from, to brass cymbals used for meditation and to induce trance in Asian animist healing traditions. The fast electronic rhythmic drumming in this experimental sound bath simulates a heartbeat that increasingly raises its tempo, a technique designed for traveling. The tension is palpable throughout this excerpt and likely made some of you extremely uncomfortable. That is because it is dense with feeling. This has been my experience during previous screenings for mixed audiences. Castellano, the co-founder of Symbiopoeisis Productions and SK Symbiotic, began mixing ritualistic and electronic instruments to create a repertoire of healing sound shortly after our residency in Kathmandu, and especially after we moved to a haunted stone house built 300 years ago. This house was constructed on land inhabited by the Delaware Nation thousands of years before the arrival of the English settlers who built it. His hybrid composition emulates the heavy beat of buffalo hooves against the ground and the mechanical and metallic aura of trains, a chain of signifiers that references the colonial violence and extermination of myriad types of persons who were made extinguishable during the advance of industrial modernization, during the founding of the United States as a settler nation, and later as an expansive global empire, and specifically cites the 20th century transformation of the ridge that frames the south of our home, where a railroad was built to facilitate the transportation of dairy milk to Jersey City. Dairy milk, which comes from cows, is a legacy of the settler colonial expansion west, where herds of buffaloes were exterminated and replaced with cows and steed and settler ranchers. This legacy is discussed beautifully in Winona LaDuke's All Our Relations, Native Struggles for Land, where she recounts the ancestral connection of buffaloes to indigenous subjectivity and activist resurgence. LaDuke is a masterful storyteller who develops an ecological ethos that weaves oral histories from indigenous community members and activists together with investigative historical research. Importantly, her work is guided by an ethical and sacred compass that asks her readers to consider complex and difficult overlapping dynamics. LaDuke explains that the buffalo extermination is particularly painful because of how ecocide and genocide are layered together in its history. She painstakingly uses historical documentation to show that the extermination of the buffalo was an intentional action tied to achieving state ownership of indigenous territory, and aimed at the erasures of these entwined nature cultures. LaDuke demonstrates that the extermination of the buffaloes not only lays the groundwork for settler occupation of the plains, but also destroys the entire ecosystem of the region, making it sick. She explains that the lack of the buffalo's thunderous weight on the terrain affects all of the entangled livelihoods in the region, and even decimates the water reservoirs upon which this region depends. Like LaDuke, Castellano is a scholar of the sacred in nature cultures. His vibrational composition seeks to exorcise the tragedy of the buffalo extermination and all of its coterminous suffering that is tied to the railroad's expansion. As a visual learner, he was taken aback by the images of mountains of accumulated skulls of buffalo that were hunted for sport from the trains using Winchester rifles while settlers traveled. To recount this history, LaDuke cites historian Tom McHugh, who explains that the speed of the railroad was much slower in the mid-1800s during the peak of this extermination. The hunt was actually a lazy pastime for the railroad travelers. It often happens that the cars and buffalo would be side by side for a mile or two. During these races, he writes, the car windows are opened, numerous breech loaders fling hundreds of bullets amongst the densely crowded and flying masses, causing almost 50 million bison to die. In retelling the story, LaDuke mourns their roaming spirits and laments the denial of ceremony to all of those kindred spirits. This is where I see a continuity between LaDuke and Castellano. For him, the music is a way of extending ceremony to the buffalo and the numerous fellow companion creatures, not all of whom are mammals, who we have felt haunting this wounded land where we have settled. I was born in New Jersey, a territory that has been renamed by settler colonizers, and that was also named Lenapehoking in the Unami and Munsee languages of the matrilineal Lenape people, who use the heteronym now of Delaware Nation. This territory is unceded and still a homeland to which they wish to return and care for. I am the proud child of two mestiza immigrants from Abya Yala, from the nations currently known as Colombia and Chile. It took me 30 years to accept and an extended stay in Europe that much of my natural cultural performance of identity and expression stems from the region now coded New Jersey, albeit as a non-binary, diasporic, Latinx New Jerseyan. I have spent more years here during my lifetime than in any other region of the world. I must acknowledge my status as a mestiza settler on this ancestral land and strive to witness, acknowledge, and be accountable to the durational violence that makes my residency here possible. There is a running joke for people who are not from New Jersey. They will ask you, so what exit do you live on? This joke reveals the primacy of the highway and car cultures in our urban and suburban planning history. The oldest, which runs through New Jersey, is known as the King's Highway. Its 1,300 miles were constructed between 1650 and 1735 on the orders of English King Charles II, who needed the transit route to connect the colonies, a reproducible technological transformation that was vital to the parasitic extractivism in the colonies that the Crown relied upon for the expansion of the British Empire. Likely, it used many of the same transit routes that were established already in the region by indigenous dwellers of Lenapehoking. But we cannot forget or ignore that these routes were also made possible by our shared natural cultural ancestors. From the bacteria which gave us the possibility of breathing oxygen to be able to become earth beings, to the rivers, the oceans, the stones, the mountains, the trees, and the plurality of creatures who also reside here and who come from varying timescales, some older and some more recent. I wonder what sense and other senses our mastodon ancestors would have used to cognitively map this terrain when they lived here 23 million years ago. Or for that matter, the possums and their marsupial ancestors when they were here 65 million years ago. During a conversation, my BFF mused about the irony of our current vehicles being dependent on these ancestral remains, on fossilized bones that have transitioned into matter that is deeply implicated in the current extermination cycle of the Necrocene. As you let that comment sink in, I want to take us back to the photograph of my bear kin on the side of the road. I want to give people a chance to close their eyes or leave while I do so. This will only be a moment, although I will warn you, there are more deaths and gore we will encounter soon. I promise these harsh images will be followed by magic. One of the things I noticed while I was preparing this talk and editing this video is that if you look towards the ear on the left of this bear, you will see a cluster of ticks. I recognize these parasitic ancestors very well because this year my doggess, Matzia, was diagnosed with Lyme disease. Stephen Buhner, an herbalist that I learned about through cyborg witch Margaretha Haughwout, who was respondingly loving to my panic over my companion species infirmities, adds to the story of what is happening in our depleted forests. Buhner's book, Healing Lyme, Natural Healing of Lyme Borreliosis and the Co-Infections Chlamydia and Spotted Fever Rickettsiosis, provides excellent research and translation of his work as an herbal healer who resists against an abundance of misinformation being dispensed by medical practitioners. Buhner explains, these bacteria have specific and very sophisticated mechanisms in place to infect a wide range of animals in the wild. The removal of one host reservoir simply motivates them to move into another. The root of this generalist is the consequence of human-generated ecological damage during the mid to late 19th and 20th centuries. As we saw through Leduc's research earlier, the loss of the buffalo has greater impacts than the settlers ever imagined. Though it rid the settlers of the so-called Indian problem through an intentional genocide that we saw was also an ecocide, the expansion of stealth pathogens is now coming for their great-grandchildren today. The extermination of creatures like buffaloes and of other keystone species like wolves and mountain lions and panthers and birds who feed on ground animals and ticks encourages massive increases of vector hosts, directly contributing to the rise and spread of bacteriological diseases like Lyme disease and a wide range of closely related others. Buhner clarifies, to wild landscapes, intrusions into forest ecosystems, the cutting of those same forests to make way for suburbs, and damage to plant diversity and its crucial homeodynamic functions by suburb and agricultural intrusions have all played a major role in stimulating the emergence of stealth pathogens. Increases in human population creates the need for more houses, often built in previously unpopulated forest systems, this significantly increases the exposure of people to pathogens. The result is damning for many diverse creatures, like Matsia, like the black bear, like the diverse populations who live in the territory renamed by settlers as New Jersey. The reduction of large wild mammal populations in undisturbed forest habitats plays its own important roles. As fewer animal populations are available as hosts, the bacterial diseases that used to be mostly limited to those populations have had no choice but to jump species and find other hosts where they can live because human beings now live in that habitat, what was formerly occupied by those animals. Buhner reiterates his point. Bacteria didn't need to infect humans to the degree they do now. There were plenty of buffalo and deer. Despite the increase in deer herds since then, humans are now the major large mammal species that lives and migrates within the Great Bison Belt. We are not inadvertent hosts. We are becoming primary reservoirs for many of the emerging diseases. Just as concerning is that Homo sapien hosts do not all have the same propensity of getting sick. It is the most vulnerable against us, and here we come back to the politics of centering those rendered inhuman by structural discrimination, who will be hit the hardest by illness, as we have seen with COVID-19. Bears and other earth creatures deserve to be part of the liberation movement being pursued by BIPOC because the continued existence of their collective mammalian bodies literally helps to prevent the sickness of our Homo sapien BIPOC communities. Yet we must strive to achieve a reciprocal survival strategy. As an ancestor who must also inhabit these damaged woodlands, this black bear and a plethora of other creatures with whom we coexist here on this land are also vulnerable to Lyme disease and the spirochetes that wreak havoc on almost every organ in our bodies. As multi-species carers, what is our responsibility in caretaking for them? And how might we strive to maintain their co-evolutionary relationship with this ancient land? One of the most significant learning spaces I had the privilege of attending this past year was called the Disability and Intersectionality Summit, founded by disability activists Sandy Ho, Mia Mingus, and many others. I had the honor to interpret for Spanish language speakers to ensure accessibility for its limited English proficiency audience members. As their research coursed through my embodied cognitive system, I was able to internalize some of their methods. For example, the simple yet profound concept of performing accessibility checks, of remembering to ask what things fellow participants of a community-oriented space need to be able to participate in a conversation or event. This is a concrete way of resisting against the ableist expectation that all people can participate in the same way and with the same needs. The conference brought lived activist experience to disability justice practice, which I had only previously learned about through the profound transmedia work performed by theorist and activist Sunara Taylor. This section of my talk has had her on my mind the entire time. There's so many brilliant things that she pontificates about in this book, but I'd like to stay with at least one concept in the short amount of time I have left here with you today. I believe that her discussion of animal crypts is necessary before we begin moving towards quantum magic. Taylor's Animal Crypts chapter explores the violence aimed at animal bodies, often intentionally and with no accountability for their capacity to experience pain and suffering. Taylor's book reveals a political primal scene that directly influences her latter work with disability justice, and her core argument of the book is that multi-species justice is intimately entangled with disability justice. Taylor presents her readers with a memory of a childhood road trip in Georgia, which I would like to resurrect partially for you here today. I vividly remember driving along the highways in our family car, of being too hot to move and drinking huge amounts of water and soda from big gulp cups. It was common to look out of our car window and to see rows and rows of chickens on massive, fast-moving trucks. These chickens were alive, often packed so tightly beside one another that the truck itself seemed to have feathers. They were clearly dying, slowly being cooked as they zoomed down the road. They were scraggly, terrible-looking birds, sometimes literally falling through the wire cages that held them in. Later, after developing a nascent art practice during studies at the University of California, Berkeley, she returned to that memory of these chickens, and she chose to work at a slaughterhouse as a site for her field research. This harrowing experience of witnessing helped her to develop a situated and transmedia approach to her ethical arguments. She explains, "I found that the disabled body is everywhere in animal industries. I also found that the animal body is integral to the way disabled bodies and minds are oppressed in the United States today. A thought struck me. If animal and disability oppression are entangled, might not that mean that their paths of liberation are entangled as well? In her chapter on animal crypts, Taylor explains the consequence of witnessing companion animals like chickens during her fieldwork in the slaughterhouse. The disabilities created in animal industries, disabilities born of speciesism, the belief in human superiority over other animals, and cruelty, have complicated my understanding of disability. She goes on. To call an animal a crip is no doubt a human projection, but it is also a way of identifying non-human animals as subjects who have been oppressed by ableism. Naming animals as crips is a way of challenging us to question our assumptions about what a cow or chicken is capable of experiencing. Animal crips challenge us to consider what is valuable about living and what is valuable about the variety of life. All animals, both those we human beings would call disabled and those we would not, are devalued and abused for many of the same basic reasons disabled people are. They are understood as incapable, as lacking in various abilities and capacities that have long been held to make human lives uniquely valuable and meaningful. In other words, they are oppressed by ableism. The able body that ableism perpetuates and privileges is not only able-bodied, but human. Taylor's analysis is complementary to recent work published by Deborah Bird Rose and Shimmer, another key interlocutor for the topic of quantum connectivities and the art of multi-species care. Bird Rose explains that it is precisely the West's nature-culture binary, which is also a human-animal binary, and which has created the violence of a hyper-separation of our worlds. Working with Dominic Lestel, Bird Rose considers ontological hatred, a type of Western antagonism that not only wants to cause suffering, but also wants to deny that animals actually suffer, leading to a constitution made possible in Western society that goes against nature in general and against the animal in particular, causing some humans to want to make animals suffer. Bird Rose explains that the desire for establishing ontological difference across these categorical borderlands of human and animal is at once a philosophical quest for the construction of the human, to identify irrevocably qualitative difference in things like communication, consciousness, emotions, and even the capacity to experience suffering, which have been defined as boundary-making differences and which are then placed in a hierarchy of human supremacy, which leaves animals with a so-called cluster of inabilities. This ontological ableism at the core of Western philosophy and its invention of the human is what our quantum connectivities undo. It is the vein of Taylor's quest to knot animal and disability liberation together, as well as an intention to thread Herd's ontological interventions and calls for hierarchical mutualism into relation, that I propose a mode of responsibility that I will call becoming service animal.
I'm drawing the tree that's also tree number 4 in the Documenta map. And this is the tree where we buried a little hedgehog girl that was named Erizo because we didn't know the sex, because we didn't want to check the sex. That wasn't the first thing we were interested in. We found her outside of her apartment, and she was really tiny. She was probably about this big. And she was full of spikes, and she was really scared at the very beginning, and then she really quickly grew to understand and understand that we weren't going to try to hurt her. And we tried to save her because we read online that there are a lot of these little baby hedgehogs that are too young. They're born too late in the summer, and so they don't have enough food. They don't build enough fat to survive the hibernation period. So we tried to save her, and we tried to love her, and we, took her into our bed on the 4th day. She slept all day in bed with me. She played in the house. We gave her lots of food. She ate a lot the first few nights. And unfortunately, on the 4th day, when she was in bed, she entered hibernation. And she just didn't make it through. Her breathing started going down. We left the house thinking that she was, just gonna go to sleep. But when we came back, her body was cold. And so it was really painful because we loved her, even though we only had her with us for 4 days. It was a very intense relationship. It was like we had this magical creature at home who was just love and who was fascinating, you know, and so different. And we had no idea what she needed and what she wanted, you know, just reading online. And there's all this fake information online. They say that they're individual animals and that they like to be alone. And, you know, in the end, we realized that she wanted to be close. She wanted to be close to a mammal. She wanted to feel heat. We kept her body for many days, and on Friday the 13th, I think, Friday the 12th or Friday the 13th, we buried her here at dusk around 6 p.m. And we did a ritual for her. We played, some music for her. We put some lights, incense. We did the mantras that we were taught by the Nepali shaman, and we offered her body to the ground. And we felt that, she had to go back. She had to go back to the ground, and it had to be here in Kassel. And we thought that this tree was really special because it's here in Kassel, there's so many different works of art, but I really liked this work because it's number 4, which is the amount of days that we had her, and which in Chinese and in Japanese means death. So, death. What can you learn more from than death? And I also liked it because it's a work, I had understood that it was a work by Jimmy Durham. I thought of your tree, of the apple tree, as the place to put her.
That's a beautiful idea.
And we went and we did the ritual for her, and we buried her at your tree.
That's a great idea.
Yesterday, and I just wanted to know what you think about that.
I think the tree will be blessed. That's a great idea. Thank you.
The route to Documenta 13 in 2012 brought us into contact with this baby hedgehog, who was our first encounter with wildlife in need on the road. My father saw her first. "Come with me," he commanded. "Hay algo maravilloso. There's something marvelous." Downstairs, right in front of the concrete path to the stairs of the building, where road meets sidewalk, she traveled in circles, looping around and around as if lost. There was doubt that we should intervene. We didn't know anything about hedgehogs. We watched her for a while, unsure and uneasy, waiting with hope that her kin would come by soon to reclaim her. She began gathering an audience of passers-by, who watched her seeking someone with a slight head tilt to the left while walking on the loop of an invisible Mobius strip. When a toddler, exiting the building, almost stepped on her tiny body, it broke the spell of inaction. Castellano lifted her from the ground and took her into the apartment. After 4 glorious days of intimacy, she died. In Germany, hedgehogs are protected by law. Nonetheless, suburbs, cars, and roads are their primary threat. I dreamt about her before we arrived in Kassel, an instance of quantum connectivity that predicted our future constellation. From Germany, we traveled to India and headed south to Goa. After a 1.5 years befriending and caring for pariah dogs on Kolva's beach, we are convinced that we encountered Matzia as a gift for our help in tending to the local multi-species commons. This is a poem I wrote her recently. Matzia. With her, it was love at first sight. I caught a glimpse, first by the bus stop to Margao. Tantra is set on the ground. Covered in fish scales, doggess, disguised by mud, anointed with vashras by Sarama, Hav Tukamok Karta. Matzia is an indigenous dog from Goa, referred to varyingly as pariah, Tazem, and Jonangi. Her presence in my life permits healing. Her companionship helps me to find jouissance in the world of the living. One of the characteristics her mother and or her pack taught her is how important it is to roam and recognize the territory we inhabit. Every day she helps me practice space, taking me to spectacular locations where we meander. She has been in training since she was 2 months old, and one of her super senses is her nose. Her vomeronasal organ is a medium of translation, allowing her to process important ideas and data so that she can better understand the happenings that are invisible to me, but that nonetheless surround the world around us. We stop and sniff ad infinitum. I have learned to enjoy the wait. We are often in locations that are breathtaking, so it's a privilege to share as much time with her as is possible. I promised you magic, but I must first promise you more death. I am about to begin showing some very difficult images full of blood and gore. They are very graphic. It is the moment to stop looking if you cannot bear to see. There is also pain on our practice trails. Matsia is an edge creature. She has never stopped wanting to navigate the road. In fact, she often prefers walks on paved concrete and not the lush forest paths we visit. When we encounter the corpses, we become forensic investigators, exploring clues about the wildlife deaths we so frequently encounter on the road. To confront double death and to turn towards life in the face of such great grief as is present amongst us in the Sixth Great Extinction, I hold present my ancestors, both living and ethereal. Accountability to the creatures begins for me as I listen for their names and stories in our encounters on the pavement and soil. Becoming animal is a durational performance of multi-species ethos and care informed by an ethics of love, animist philosophy, and transmedia ritual. I invoke and offer gratitude to Mohan Rai, Danishan, Parvati Rai, my healer mentors, for their tantric pedagogy and the training that they offered us at Kathmandu's Center for Shamanistic Studies. My practice takes matters seriously. It is informed by these specific Jankri teachers and also makes room for an extended engagement with media and materialities through which I craft my own rituals of recognition and release for these multi-species ancestors. I share song and breath with them as I come near, sometimes cupping their remains in my hand, recording death masks through photographic and video registers of their suspended corpses amidst the sound of the whizzing cars who so often cause their death. When possible, I move their bodies to the weedy wastelands nearby, to the mugwort and the dandelion. The turkey vultures and crows often watch my ritual, not so patient to resume their interrupted feast. But by placing them towards the edges of the wounded wild, I am attempting to protect these scavengers from their own double death as they perform their vital and ancestral multi-species labor. The deep violence of the Sixth Great Extinction needs to be witnessed, insists Deborah Bird Rose, as she calls for slow writing in the Anthropocene. My walks with Matsia and my transmedia engagements with these creatures are a type of slow writing in the Necrocene. Let me share an example. As I drove to work today, I was pierced by the vision of 3 raccoons who made the fatal decision to try and cross the concrete division of the superhighway during a rush of traffic at dawn. I wince each time I see one splayed out on the concrete, for I recognize all too well their position, the way their heads are gripped by their prehensile hands, the way their bodies curl in a type of fetal position to protect their bodies from the impact behaviors I have seen them use to protect themselves when they are alive. Their bodies are fresh additions to what feels like a never-ending tally of woodland creatures who I try to make note of daily as a small ritual of remembrance, a conscious effort to not just look away, to not just deviate my attention while participating in my own daily grind of survival. Yesterday, in the early morning hours, I almost stepped on a piece of a possum's liver that lied ahead on the rest of their body. It was flipped inside out from the impact of thousands of pounds that were coupled with speed. I was told by a wildlife rehabilitation person that it's important to check fresh possum corpses on the side of the road because if female, their marsupial pouches might be full of orphaned joeys. And so despite my body's resistance, despite the sadness, I go to check. It is the 6th day after Loki's sudden death and I encounter this possum in the snow. I am struck by the beauty of her ear, which blends from black to a tip of pink in a gentle curve. Her tail is a grid of texture, her feet pale rose. She has 5 fingers. The one with no claw is her opposable thumb. I check the pouch and I find possibility. Happiness is discarded on the street, a wise Chilean activist once told me, referring then to the sheer quantity of roaming animals that she cared for and worried about. The comment was also a critique to her neighbors, directed towards their lack of action and the impoverished solidarity from their companion species who struggle on the street. There's a soft spot in my heart for possums, extraordinary marsupials who glow under black light with their white hair and their bald, prehensile tails. Many people actively swerve their cars to hit them because they say they are ugly. Maybe it's because of their long, leathery, hairless tails, or is it their toothy smiles? I don't understand this colonial gaze and its disregard for the wonder they inspire. I try to take my time to notice each one's unique characteristics. It doesn't make me understand why someone would be uninspired by their survival skills, which have kept them in this region for at least 1 million years. I see you, Possum Mama. We recognize your wonder. On May 14th, 2022, at around 8 a.m., not even a mile away from the house, I saw a possum surrounded by crushed bone and blood in the middle of the street at the intersection. It was still early, so I stopped. I took off the purple gloves after moving her body to be able to take photographs. I noticed the pool of blood that spilled from her mouth, creating a gruesome red graffiti circle on the pavement. As I sang to her and called out to the earth healers, I looked down and noticed that she had dead babies coming out of her pouch, and I asked the air why. Why do I keep seeing possums with dead babies? I documented the scene, attempting to take close-ups of the Joeys who died with their mother during the impact. I returned to the car, and when I looked back to the side of the road to say goodbye, I realized I'd forgotten my gloves on the railing, so I returned. I sang the protective verses again. I do this almost always for the roadkill. And as I glanced down, as I prepared to take my leave, there weren't just two babies who were dead anymore. There was a baby who had emerged from the pouch. Their eyes were half open, and the adrenaline rush jolted me into action. I was clumsy. Oh my doggus, there's a survivor! And so I put down my phone and went back for disposable gloves to explore the pouch completely. And as I removed the orphans, I put them inside my microfiber pocket. I've spent a year attending wildlife conferences since I met Elisa to ensure that I know what to do in a situation like this. But I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, but I do know what to do. I know I must take care of them. I went home and put them in a plastic container. And then I went and drove them to my local rehabilitator at Anlet Ridge. Content for the day for my performance as a service animal. Thank you for listening.
Yo me porto bien, yo soy tu perre fiel.
Oh, Loki. Seeing Loki, who I know recently passed away, in very close proximity to my own beloved cat, who I rescued in China, named Nina, who is the twin sister of Goonie, who some of you may know is now in mortal danger, having gotten extremely depressed after his sister died in a terrible accident, engaging with human infrastructures. And now I'm trying to deal with daily subcutaneous fluids to keep him alive, and he's very resistant to my ministrations. Seeing Loki's picture at the end made me feel deeply the thread that connects all life and all beings, much like that thread of the Athena spider that Ciclón encountered on the path while trying to search for the right transmediation, when in fact nature had already supplied something that didn't need to be a metaphor, that indeed was, as Peirce would say, an iconic sign representing the interconnectedness in the web of life through a literal and actual web. Wow. I don't know if you are all as filled with tumultuous emotions and ideas as I am, but I would like to, without pausing to think too much about what we are feeling, I would like to plunge us into a conversation that will be initiated by our wonderful roundtable speakers. Margaretha Haughwout, who collaborates with humans and more than human beings across technologies and ecologies, gesturing to possible worlds, worlds that generate abundance, presence, and relationships, and antagonize regimes of private property. Her work manifests as speculative fabulation, intervention, participatory event, walking tour, experimental pedagogy, installation, and as biological process. Margaretha's active collaborations include the Coven Intelligence Program with, I'm going to mispronounce this, Efrain Cruz Cortez, a coven that uncovers revolutionary ecologies between witches, plants, and machines, the guerrilla grafters with Ian Pollock and Tara Hui, who graft fruit-bearing branches onto non-fruit-bearing ornamental street trees in the urban environment. Rudderal witchcraft with Oliver Kellhammer, considering of set of practices specific to planetary, weedy natures that work their way at edges and in the interstices of public and private property, and which are entangled with a range of other human and more than human outcasts of capitalist modernity. And the annual Grafters Exchange, where bioregional eco-artists and fruit tree enthusiasts continue the work toward abundant food forest futures. Most recently, Margaretha's work has been featured at a bunch of wonderful prestigious places, including the Pixelach Festival in Helsinki, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, Staatswerkstatt in Electronica in Linz, Austria, and Ustan Gallery at Bennington College. And her writing has recently been published in an anthology about social practice, and a forthcoming, sorry if I'm skipping through some of this, many publications, Rudderal Witchcraft Manifesto, which she co-authored with Oliver Kellhammer, coming out soon by Duke University Press. And Margaretha is one of our wonderful UC Santa Cruz people. We've got her MFA there, and in her studio art classes at Colgate has been drawing connections between avant-garde legacies, emerging media, art, and collaboration in order to foster distributed artistic approaches to the interconnected issues of our time. Our other roundtable speaker, Oliver Kellhammer, is an artist, a writer, and researcher who turns to botanical interventions and social art practice to demonstrate nature's surprising ability to recover from damage. Recent work has focused on the psychosocial effects of climate change, decontaminated polluted soil, reintroducing prehistoric trees to landscapes impacted by industrial logging, and cataloging biodiversity of post-industrial sites. Kellhammer is interested in exploring regeneration in the wake of human disturbance. Hear that, students studying feral atlas? Human disturbance, either through passive field observation, what can I not do, of biota recolonizing industrial land or wastelands, or by actively engaging with the biological and socio-political processes that inform these landscapes by attempting to improve their relations with one another. The latter approach often takes the form of what he calls botanical interventions, whereby horticultural techniques mitigate problems between people and the landscape, enhancing both the sense of the place and its ecological carrying capacity, as well as addressing some problems such as erosion, availability of affordable and nutritious food, and the frequent lack of agency low-income communities are allowed over a design of their urban spaces. Kellhammer's past projects included community access biomaterials plantation, a reforestation of an eroded railway ravine, where vegetation is now protected as intellectual property, and working with squatters in Canada's poorest neighborhood to establish the country's first public permaculture, food forest, and Asian ethno-botanical arboretum. Recent interventions have focused on the speculative botany of climate change, the role of brownfield ecologies as refugia for biodiversity. And Kellhammer's interventions, when elaborated, are deliberately anti-monumental. They integrate into the ecological and cultural communities that form around them, with the role of the artist becoming increasingly obscured Kellhammer has been living with an endangered turtle for 55 years. So I would love us to get our discussion going, and I want to hear about this turtle and these interventions and the way we run these roundtables. For those of you who are new, we are an anti-conference. This is not a formal presentation of our professional competencies, but a discussion that starts from a place of shared vulnerability and the human and more than human condition. And just springboarding off of some of the provocations and threads that were woven in the web, spun and cast for us by Ciclón's talk. So I would love to, we don't have any particular order of preference. Whoever feels like jumping in and throwing out some thoughts, we can start there. Audience members, soon enough, we shall like to bring in some of your questions for everyone to discuss. I should not be spotlighted, actually. I'll just be one of the other speakers. But we will have just the roundtable discussion. People can start putting comments and questions in the chat. And at the right appropriate feeling time, I'll pull out some of those questions, and some of you may be comfortable to ask them yourselves, which would be better than me reading them. But if you are too uncomfortable to read them yourself, that's okay too. You can note in the chat. But please, whoever changed the setting, can someone fix it back so that I am not spotlighted and that our speaker participants, Oliver, Ciclón, and Margaretha, join me in this roundtable discussion. And who wants to give it a start?
Well,
Go ahead, Margaretha, you go.
No. Well, Ciclón, I just wanted to thank you so much for really making time for grief. I found myself so moved the first time I watched this video this past week, and then so moved again watching it. And just one of the things that I've been thinking about with Oliver is the way that this practice of necromancy that you're engaged with is a practice of timecraft. And a range that we can understand timecraft in a range of different ways, but one of the most significant ways is just the practice of making time. And I think that grief is a practice of making time. And so your practice of necromancy made time for all of us to sort of be with these animals and with one another.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. As I was screening this, I could hear the sobs of my partner downstairs. And so I had to stop for a second and just hope that the video screening would not be interrupted in the few moments that I left my desk to just go and embrace him. And there's so many things that are not in this lecture. And the lecture feels incomplete to me. The work always feels incomplete to me. There's so many things that are gestured at, but are never quite complete. And it's so interesting that how we experience grief is so different. And I think that I really appreciate that comment. I really appreciate this idea of making time, because I think that's exactly, like, you get at the crux of it, right? Like, that's exactly what we don't have time. That's why people just drive by, right? Like, that's why they hit the deer. That's why they hit the truck or the bear, because we're rushing, right? Like, we're not here. We're not present.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a dynamic there, right? There's rushing away as well. I think speaking in the US context, we're all rushing away from our grief all the time, right? And I always return to Theses on the Philosophy of History by Walter Benjamin, when he talks about the sort of angel of progress is thrown into the future by these narratives of progress that we have. And there's this mounting catastrophe, literally as a result of that sort of propulsion into the future. There's this mounting catastrophe that can never be tended to. So the practice of stopping and tending to the catastrophe is quite powerful. And
and is literally what we need to do for our own survival, for our own multi-species survival, multi-species justice. Yeah.
So I just want to say that part of the reason why I'm excited about being here today is I actually, you know, beyond the smartness, I'm interested in the non-rational, right? I'm interested in, and this is in particular why I invited you and Oliver here. I think that there's something about academic practice, right? That there's a certain convention, right, that we are used to working in. But I really appreciate practitioners who are, you know, willing to kind of deviate from that normative practice of knowledge making. And it's the reason I really wanted both you and Oliver to be here. Both of you have practices that really engage magic, like that really engage knowledge that is kind of uncomfortable, I would say, for like the more traditional discourse. I was reading Oliver's work last night, and I just really, I did post a podcast that is about Marmaduke. I think it's really phenomenal that Oliver has a 55-year relationship with a turtle that has no signs of slowing down. And it's why, you know, one of the reasons why I was like attracted to Oliver was that I was like, I need to talk to you. But then I was also in preparation for this today, I wanted to, you know, I've been in conversation more with Margaretha over the years than with Oliver. And I just wanted to say that, of course, as I was reading up on my co-presenters, I was reading Oliver's article on becoming non-human. And what I realized is that Oliver has been writing about Jacob von Uexküll for a long time, right? So I learned about Jacob von Uexküll's Umwelt through Ed Yong's book, which I really recommend everyone pick up and buy a copy because it's just so phenomenal, the way that it redoes aesthetics, right? From different beings, from different bodies. But I'm also just really compelled by Oliver, who has had these like relationships with such diverse creatures, right? So we've got the turtle, we've got Marmaduke, but then there's this slime, right? That this amoebic presence in Oliver's writing that on top of it becomes this oracle. You know, it's like, and it's this positive reinforcement oracle, right? So he's feeding this slime oatmeal flakes to be able to get answers, right? And the answers aren't always clear. And I just want to just celebrate divination for a moment. And, you know, I don't know, I want us to go out there. I want us to have, I mean, Maya said this is a freewheeling conversation. You know, I'm really curious by some of the people who spoke in the chat. For example, Tong, you said that it reminded you of the music of your ancestors. I want to know who your ancestors are. And then also Abu Bakr Mohammed Jamal, you said something similar happened to tribes in Andaman and Nicobar with the road through their lands. I mean, I want to learn from you all too. So by all means.
Atong, you want to start? Tell them about your people.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for this moment. I also would like to thank Ajamaya for allowing us to be part of this event, you know. Of course, the music, you know, like when the train scene starts, you know, like I was thinking it's just normal, but when I, you know, when I listen more into it, I feel like it was taking me back to those past, you know, about my ancestors. I'm from Naga background, Naga people. My land is at the tri-junction of India, Burma, and China, but it is under, of course, Zomia of James Scott. Yeah, very much happy to be, you know, attending this event. I'm happy to hear some good insights from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Atong.
Thank you, Atong, and please keep in touch. You know, the Nagas are close to me, so I really would love to be in conversation with you later on too.
Luckily,
Thank you.
Atong is one of my graduate students, so that's no problem. Always has very good provocative things to share and say. How about who else wants to introduce their question from the group? If not, I'd love to hear what Oliver has to say. We can go on to questions in a bit.
Sure. This is like the third time I've watched that presentation, and I just every time I just love it more. It's so rich and sad and beautiful, but also hopeful. So I thank Ciclón for this opportunity, and I was just thinking a lot of simultaneous things, many of them contradictory. So, I mean, the whole death issue, you know, the great question of life and death, like they say in Zen Buddhism, you know, like what is it, you know, and I every time I think I understand something, I confuse myself, and so I was thinking of experiences like you know, the great extinction event that we're all so concerned about. And it's absolutely horrific, and we're losing species by the second. But then there's these countervailing trends, right? For example, I remember, you know, when I was a little kid playing in Germany in the forest across from my grandmother's house, I was looking for newts, these salamanders in the ponds, and it was great because there were all these newts. And then I learned later that these ponds were bomb craters, and that, you know, a few decades before, there was these huge fire bombings of Stuttgart, where the entire landscape had been charred to nothing, right? So then, but because the landscape in a way had been devastated and had become a necro landscape, it actually generated life. And years later, I saw, you know, when the Berlin Wall was still up, no man's land, or the death zone between the two walls, which was a minefield, was a very rich urban savanna with wildflowers that had gone extinct everywhere else in the landscape because of industrial farming. So in a way, these kind of militarized death landscapes actually became progenitors of life. And so I'm constantly like struggling between the grief and the hope, right? So and that's what I was so interested in Ciclón's position. Like, on the one hand, from the opossum's point of view, you know, the subjectivity of the opossum, you know, they're really suffering. But on the other hand, they're actually increasing in the range. Like when I was a little kid in Toronto, there was no opossums, right? But because of climate change, it's gotten slightly warmer. So now opossums are moving further north and expanding their what they can consider, you know, a place worthy of living, right? So I'm always wondering about our subjectivity versus the non-human subjectivity. So, you know, going back to the turtle who's stomping around here somewhere, it's a constant problem. Like, you know, there's so much, I feel so sad for the world, but how does the opossum feel? How does, you know, their relationship to death, you know, sometimes it's very different from ours, and yet equally profound, you know. And so going, you know, to kind of imagine the subjectivity of the non-human other is such a central challenge to our compassion and being with, right? And it's always imperfect, and it's always this like, oh, I wish I knew more. And that's where von Uexküll was so brilliant, was imagining what it would be like to be a tick, right? And he showed those images of the tick on the bear's ear. Now the bear died, and that seems outwardly very sad, but ticks are doing great. If you're a tick, this is the halcyon time of ticks. This is like, oh my God, there's just so many hosts and so much blood, and woohoo, ticks, you know, this is like their golden age, right? And so
right,
from a tick's point of view, this is all good, you know? So how do you deal with that? Now, the tick is a worthy subject. The tick has an Umwelt, the tick has thoughts and it's, you know, they're going back to von Uexküll, the whole idea of biosemiotics, right? Like how does what's important to the tick? And obviously getting lots of good blood is important, right? So happy times for the tick, maybe not so much for the you know, endangered Florida panther or something. So I'm always torn, and I think your video, Ciclón, really deals with this. Like there's no separation between the self and other in you know, certainly in many philosophies like Buddhism. However, the tick, should I have more affinity for the tick or for the mammal, because I'm more mammalian? So outwardly, when I see a fuzzy, cute creature that had suffered a violent death, I have this pang of grief, right? But the tick is also a subject and also a living being that has views, and so how should I feel about that? Like, I have this sort of natural, perhaps, or maybe unnatural, maybe it's a prejudice, a bias towards the mammal, and I'm questioning that in myself as a sort of you know, sort of a priori prejudice, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, whether we're attracted to the
I have a
suffering
couple
of
things.
some. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, so there's a couple things. I love what you said, first of all, about like, it's a great, like, I think about that a lot in terms of like deer. It seems like deer are doing great in the Anthropocene, at least where I am in central New York. Lots of species seem to be doing great. The tick seems to be thriving. And yet at the same time, I'm sort of thinking about what Ciclón brings up in relationship to the sort of decimation of really complex ecologies in favor of the simplification of ecologies, right? And what Haraway and Singh characterizes the plantationocene, right? The sort of radical simplification of ecologies, depletion of an ecological base, which really creates a sort of a migration or a diaspora, really, of pathogens, right? So all of a sudden, you know, like the COVID, the coronavirus is unleashed into new hosts, which may seem like, wow, all these new hosts, so exciting, but also because we don't really know, it could also be a real crisis for those pathogens of no longer having their traditional hosts. So just a question in terms of what's going on for the tick in this particular moment, in terms of its sort of migration to new hosts and what that experience might be. And at the same time, recognizing that there does seem to be a flourishing from our vantage point. And then also just wanting to sort of push into the difference between sadness and grief. In my experience, to me, they're very, very different, and both really important emotions to have. I'm trying to think of the author who really taught me a lot about grief, Stephen Jenkinson talks about grief is love that has for a being or beings that has moved out of view, right? So it has a much different valence to me in terms of what the practice is. So just wanting to sort of feel into that a little bit in terms of sometimes they come together, right? There's sadness and grief, but sometimes there can be profound happiness and joy within the space of grief, almost an elation or a new set of relationships that emerge. But I loved what you said about the sort of possibilities within grief. It's like we can't sort of look to the future necessarily when we're in grief, because then we are no longer grieving. But in that practice of grief, it can be profoundly generative in a way. So just some things that. But I also want to return to this divination thing.
That we will get to the magic, I promise.
Okay. Cool.
So one of the things that surprised me about Ed Young's book that I've been reading, it's kind of like my pleasure in the morning. I'm trying to break the cycle of obsessively looking at my phone and the news in the morning, which is the first thing I usually do when I wake up because everybody else is asleep and I can't sleep. And so I've been turning to Ed Yong's book to read in the morning because it just makes my day so much better, learning about different umwelts. But one of the things that Ed Yong says that I think is a really, provocative thing to think with when we're thinking with Oliver's question about the ticks, right? The ticks worldview, is that Ed Yong, he says there's symbiosis, but we can't forget that there's like a vast majority of species on Earth who are parasitic. So like, what, how does, I feel like there's this questioning, right? Like, especially when we're thinking about what the role of like so-called humans is, and like this question of capital in the background and, other extinction events. But I feel like there's this real grappling for me with like, how much of that parasitism that we see is actually like also existed. It's not just human, right? It's not just capital. Like there's also something to be said for that beingness, right? I don't think it's settled. Like, I don't think it's, I think it's supposed to be unsettling, right? And I'm thinking of Ashley Dawson's work too, because, he also gestures at like, prior extinction events and like how we can make sense of these together. And, there's this question for me when you said that about thriving species, Margaretha, because that, that the bears are thriving now. There's a part of me that's like, yes, but there's also a part of me like, what does that mean, right? Like thriving according to the bears or thriving according to us? Thriving according to the hunters for sure in New Jersey who want the license to be able to kill them in more gruesome ways, right? Like that's been like the argument is like, how can we control the bear population? But then as an immigrant, like, or as the child of immigrants, I think that's why I have this tension with this like simplification of what it means to thrive, right? Because in this discourse of invasive species, it's always from a human umwelt, and it's usually from a business commercial umwelt. But what happens when we begin to understand ourselves as invasive species, and who do we include inside of that invasive species, right? And is it only business, or is it also something else? I don't have any simple answers, In terms of the tick, I will say this, Oliver. The first essay that I wrote for Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing actually recounts a story about my poodle, Luke, who for me is kind of like my guide to the, divination world, who opens up this portal of like paying attention to dreams, who is my first experience with premonitory seeing, right? Or at least more recent memory, because he's unearthed other memories from before, which is what that portal was about. But he protected a tick on his body, like he was like, don't take this tick off of me. And I relayed that in my essay to both Haraway and to Tsing. And it was interesting because they both were resistant. Like I think especially Anna Tsing was resistant. She was like, are you sure that this is what was happening? And I feel like Luke was giving me a message. And now that you ask about that tick's umwelt, Oliver, I can't help but remember ticks. I can't help but remember Luke's protection of the tick, like that, it's a very difficult dynamic.
That's such a great point. I mean, we, because of there's a strange kind of tendency that is kind of socially reinforced to have revulsion against ticks, right? Because they do carry diseases that affect us and companion animals. But there's a strange kind of exterminism around these things. I was right now the big thing here in the Northeast is the spotted lanternfly. So it's this beautiful insect that is invasive, right? And there's this incredible kind of like exterminationist rhetoric. You have to kill them. You have to stomp on them in the most brutal way. And I was going for a run along the East River here, and one of them flew across the path, and I picked it up, and it was the most beautiful thing, red underwings, and it was this unbelievably beautiful insect. And I couldn't kill it, and I didn't think it was right, and it was very interesting because the the urge to kill it was stimulated by capitalist ideas that, okay, these are bad for apple trees, which is in itself an invasive tree that was brought from Europe, you know. And the main host of the spotted lanternfly is the ailanthus tree, which is a common weed, which also came from other places. So the whole system is already in this huge state of flux, right? So the idea of like exterminating one thing because it's a sort of anti-capitalist organism, you know, and this idea of what is automatically legitimate ecologically, what is the, you know, this sort of prelapsarian state, you know, like, and yet, and the truth is, you know, there have been massive, I mean, we are responsible, you know, in sort of capitalist settler colonialism for massive suffering and extinction. There's no doubt about that, and there's a culpability, but there are other things that are happening, and there's responses to those things. I mean, you know, like, for example, the coyote did not exist in its present form up until quite recently in the Northeast. The thing that we have now is this hybrid animal between coyote, wolf, and dog. It's not even a species, but it responded to the extermination of predators. And now we have this other thing where the entity itself, which is a kind of dream entity, it resists categorization. It's a chimera of becoming, you know, predator. Like it's not even a thing that science can really deal with, right? It's like, it's not a dog, it's not a coyote. So these magical processes kind of resist capitalism, and the lanternfly is one of these things. It's like this messenger from another world. And I mean, I know they're bad for certain things, but I find them really fascinating too. So again, I could not stomp on this thing. And I think so much of our conditioning is about this sort of, you know, Judeo-Christian sense of order where we're supposed to be, you know, controlling everything. And I think that's a very, very unfortunate tendency. And that, you know, so we have to find a more complicated way of a more compassionate way of being with as opposed to being against. So you know, that's probably a very muddled statement, but I'm just keep thinking about the tick and how, you know, they have the world, they have a world, they have rights.
That really touches on a conversation that we had in one of our previous talks when Heather Davis gave a talk, and Julieta Aranda and Tejo Shah were part of it. We talked about loving the unlovable, what counts as unlovable, and what does it mean to talk about multi-species thrivings with critters that might not serve our human interests, which are sort of the weedy beings of the animal world, right? And have their own intrinsic reasons for existence and ways of being. We have a series of questions, I think, that perfectly segue in with this. So we've got a question. Let's take Am, Jamal, and then Vanya, and then Blake. How about in that order? You want to ask your question first? Go ahead, or make your comment.
Hello. So am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So Ciclón mentioned the ecocide that happened in the United States against the native population involving the buffaloes, and similar exterminations and ecological crises are seen in settler colonial societies in other places. So if you were to look at Australia and the many situations that it has faced, many ecological disasters, invasive species, and similarly the ecological crisis in Israel. So a lot of these societies, in their goal to completely otherize anything native to the land, ended up otherizing even the non-human and the like. But in the case of extraction colonialism, it was more of a deindustrialization, so that you could extract this land of its resources and use the humans as vehicles to extract it. And so you see post-colonial states, which I had mentioned with the whole Andaman situation, you see post-colonial states have this rush to industrialize rapidly, build dams. And this actually became a huge problem. Build dams, build roads, and the like. Though this ends up having a negative impact on the ecology. For example, the Great Indian Bustard is threatened by electrical wiring, and the indigenous people of Andaman are suffering due to the road that has been built in. And the Andaman is a little more complex because it is Indian settler colonial project in many ways. So it's a little more complex there. But a lot of these situations, there has to be some sort of agreement or marriage of the goals of the decolonial process and the ecological, right? The questioning of arbitrary human constructs. Similarly, the second thing that I wanted to raise was the mention of pariah is an interesting segue there, because there is also a need for perspectives from various local systems, right? So knowledge about, for example, pariah is a slur in India for the lower castes, and a lot of the knowledge generated out of India, including about veganism and vegan narratives in India. I've had a conversation with Dr. Kóvskaya before on this. A lot of these have to also be understood within the light of the local politics. So I just wanted to add that. And of course, I mean, one interesting thing I noticed with the mention of roads in New Jersey, because I'm a fan of Springsteen, it suddenly all made sense. The constant imagery of roads and cars.
Wonderful.
That's
Let's take
awesome.
Vanya's comment and Blake's comment, and that way you guys can kind of respond to them together, because I think they're all connected. Vanya, do you want to make your comment? Turn on your video and join us. Are you there, Vanya? Did we lose you? Hello? Oh, you can't turn on the video now? Do you want to just speak your comment then? Or we can have Blake go first and then you can sort out your situation. How about Blake make your question and comment, and then Vanya, if you can either type your question, if you can't say it, go ahead.
Hi, so hopefully I expressed this coherently, but the thing that I was interested in, there was a part of the subtitle of your talk, Ciclón, that mentions casting a circle of protection. And the way that you mean that, I think of course means in a magical sense, which in my view or experience has always been built on a relationality, and has been used by populations as a defense mechanism and a protection mechanism in a world that is designed to oppress or harm them in many ways. But of course, the human world has its own modes of protection that are not magical or not relational, are instead technological and militaristic, and are often quite harmful, antithetical to a relational paradigm. So I think the question that I kind of want to provoke is, how might we undo our paradigm of protection beyond modes of containment, control, and distancing to engage in something that's more relational?
Someone's microphone is on. Please mute your mics, everybody, if you're not on the panel. Thank you. Okay, sorry.
So Blake, I actually want to respond to that very situatedly, because it's a wonderful question, but it's a big question. But I think it'll help if I explain where I got this idea of casting the circle from, because I didn't mention that in the talk. It's one of the parts that I cut. There's a whole part of this talk that I feel very incomplete about, and there's Zakiya Iman Jackson is really on my mind when I'm thinking about the abolition of the human. In fact, it's her term the abolition of the human. I'm thinking with Che Gasset. But in particular, I was thinking when the topic of casting a circle, I had never thought about casting a circle. I'm not really that close to Wicca. Okay, so you know, like the witch tradition in the United States, like this is something I'm learning about. And I was telling Margaretha about an episode of street violence that had happened against my partner. My partner was being threatened with car ramming by a neighbor of ours. So this is when somebody uses their vehicle as a weapon. And it was in part because I had trespassed on their property. And for some reason, people, when they take out their vengeance, they don't take it out on me. I think probably because I'm a little bit more protected in front of the law. Whereas they do feel that right with my partner, who's a little bit in a different type of asymmetrical relationality to the United States legal system. And so I was really scared, you know, like that we were having these encounters with this white man neighbor who was being very aggressive with his vehicle and who would say things like, stay off my property, to both of us when we were walking Matsia. And it was like Matsia became, and this has happened with all of our companion species, when people see that you care about them, it's like your Achilles tendon, right? Like people, or your Achilles heel, people know that that's where your soft spot is, and that they know that because the animal is property, you know, if they run it over, there's not going to be as big of a consequence as if it was a person, right? And then same thing with people, you know, some people have more value in our country and some people have less, right? So I was at odds because I had called the police and I had left a record about it, but the police weren't interested in my analysis of bias, and they were just like, whatever. And they didn't even make a police report. And so I was like, what do I do? Right? What do I do to protect my partner? What do I do to protect my little circle, my little inner kinship circle? And I was telling Margaretha about the experience, and she was like, and they were like, why not do a circle of protection with salt around the house? And it was just like fireworks, you know, like I had never thought about salt and about creating this force field, right? I haven't done it yet. I did make a very small circle of protection in the backyard on like the border between our property and the other neighbor who was also, we were also in some dispute about cutting down the weeds. But, you know, I really think that part of the reason why I invoked magic is because I do think that we have to move beyond the rational, right? Like there's a part of me that believes that I need a gun where I live because my neighbors are all armed. But there's a part of me that also feels like I need something that protects me that's greater than the gun. And that's where the magic comes in. And the spirits and the ancestors and the animal ancestors and, you know, the ether and the plant. Like I do believe, I do extend my cognitive worlding to these powers that are beyond what we've been taught as rational. And I think that it's really interesting to think about what the circle is. There's there's the Buddhist story of the Buddha with too many arms, right? Like there's the Buddha who wants to help everyone and who has to grow all these arms because they're trying to reach out and help everybody. And it's impossible to help everybody, right? So I think metaphorically thinking about the circle as like understanding your limits also of where you can extend that reach, because there's a moment in which everyone becomes abstract again, right? And so I think it's really what I was trying to do with this talk, which is very much inspired by the people who are here, by Maya, by Stella, by Margaretha, by Oliver, is I want to cast them as part of my circle. So, I mean, I'm happy to hear more from my honored guests.
I actually have a couple of threads I wanted to just throw into the mix, and then everybody can maybe talk about them. So one of the things that really stuck with me in the talk, that threaded really throughout it, was really looking at, of course, entanglements. That's our metaphor du jour, or, you know, of this epoch. But thinking how genocide and ecocide are not only happening at the same time, not only co-occurring, but that they're indexically, causally entangled, and sometimes quite intentionally so. Thinking about the trophic cascades that emerge from the loss of a single species, the reverberations on that web of life when one single thread is plucked. I am thinking about especially how you talked about how entanglement necessitates intersectionality, both in our analyses of the problem, but also in our prescriptions for how to deal with it. And thinking about why specifically intersectionality only really makes sense if we include the multi-species world of agents that are not human animals, but are many other kinds of beings. Maybe they're rivers and forests and not living beings as well, but are agential world makers nonetheless. And you brought in thinking about racism, disability, thinking about colonialism, thinking about industrialization and the construction of a society where, industrial infrastructures become both a generative tool for making many things new possible as a sort of major world making device, but are also deeply entangled with violence, both intentional and unintentional. And then, of course, bringing in Deborah Bird-Rose's Shimmer and her thinking about the need to think about humans and humans in a way that takes us outside of the really fucked up mode of thinking about being a human that we inherited from, the Cartesian dualist split, from the Enlightenment, possibly much even earlier, possibly from monotheism. From the Greeks, from the Great Chain of Being, there's this whole genealogy of ruptures, ontologically species-defining ruptures of this human animal from all other forms of animal, so much that the word animal becomes an insult to humans. And of course, we know the moves of dehumanization, rendering humans into the category of animal is one of the classic tropes that has been used to extract, to deny dependency on, to radically exclude, to borrow on Plumwood's language. So thinking about all of these entanglements, about the pursuit of justice through an intersectional lens that must not only acknowledge race and class and gender and caste, but must also acknowledge the reach of justice and injustice questions to beyond the human. And your answer really was, I found really moving and interesting, but needing a lot more unpacking. And this becoming service animals. I want you to talk. You gave an example with the wildlife rehab and rescuing the joeys and doing that service, performing that service, a service of reparation in a sense that was very specific for those individual beings, but also performs an ethos of care. I'd like to hear from all of you, and then also people in the audience thinking about this as we engage in an abolition of the human qua anthropos, the human as built in that image. We already know that many indigenous cultures never bought into, or many cultures that didn't, such as Chinese culture doesn't have a Cartesian dualism either. There are many ways of thinking of the human that don't have to come out of the Western genealogy that we all know now is truly deeply troubled and has left us with a legacy of real problems. So can we talk about what becoming service animal means? Because of course, the idea of a service animal very much comes out of a Western rights-oriented discourse. But I feel like it could become, if we can think about this beyond the Western paradigms, beyond the modern rationalist paradigms, what is a service animal? What does it mean to be a service animal? How can we humans become service animals? What does it mean to serve other animals when it's not serving them on our plates? I'd like to hear from everybody. And also, by the way, because it is already 9:09 and we said we'd stop at 9, anybody who needs to go, of course, we thank you for coming and we'll be posting the video so you can hear the rest if you need to go. But try to stick with us if you can. All right.
I could just,
Sorry,
oh, go ahead.
I'm ready
Go ahead.
Oh, you want to throw your question in, Vanya?
Oh,
Okay, and then we
really
can go on. All right.
Yeah, just I think I have pretty much of different commentaries on the topic in my head, and I won't deliver all of them. But just in this time regarding the service animal, during the talk, I was thinking that actually capitalism is the system that pushes you to become a service animal, and the only difference of to whom you deliver the service, to whom you actually make a job, and why it is very much important to serve another species is that humans are the animals that endowment with the capital in their interrelationships, and the other species are not operating with the capital. So once you decide to deliver your efforts and service to other species, you somehow escaping, or at least partially escaping, this constant and continuous flow of capital. But in fact, I think we all are service animals just because we are pushed to do something. We are pushed to work. We are pushed to service and be useful and be validated by your income or your how to say it, gratification of the capital system.
I love that. I just think that's really interesting. I think it enables us to make a few connections between what Maya was saying and Ciclón, what Oliver and I have been thinking about. I'm finding myself, and also connecting to some of the initial comments from one of the first questions from the audience, whose name I can't remember. But just wanting to throw out this quote that I put in the chat, which I learned from Jason Moore, but I think originally comes from Claudia von Werlhoff, who says that nature is everything that the bourgeoisie doesn't want to pay for, right? So when we think about the sort of dawn of the early market system, the early modernity, with the sort of the movements of enclosure, which we can understand as European colonization, but that also affected Europe itself, right, through enclosure of the commons, which also included the the extermination of hundreds of thousands of women, right, who were organizing in the commons and coming up with really viable ways of imagining alternatives to feudalism, right? All of these peoples, right? And here I'm tracking the work that that Silvia Federici and others have done to sort of understand what is at stake, right, in this sort of binary of human and non-human, the binary of mind and body, the binary of society and nature, right? And the ways that people that were organizing in the commons, right, understanding the commons to be shared spaces of cooperative labor and shared resource, people that are healers, people that are operating in service, people that are facilitators that can sort of remember histories of use of resources, histories of cooperation. All of those people needed to be killed, right? They needed to be taken off the stage for a certain kind of hierarchy to take place, right? So that in really understanding that all of these binaries, right, really mask a singularity, right? The human, non-human, and this comes from Deborah Bird-Rose. She taught me this, that the binary between human and non-human masks the singularity that is human, right? The mind-body distinction masks the singularity that is actually the mind. And right, so then we have this sort of historically white male cisgendered, heteropatriarchal sort of dominance that takes place. And so as we start to undo this, and all of this work of service for those that are left becomes unpaid, becomes sort of in the sort of not respected, not valued space of nature, right? And so as we sort of resuscitate the value of service, right, that Ciclón gives us, I think there's real power there that is, as we learn to value it within our own communities, across and in our international communities as well, right? That there's new sorts of value, new sorts of relationship that emerge. And one of which I think really significantly, just going back to the initial things that we were saying, that one of the values is time, right? Like there's a way that that we can understand the value of our work through the creation of time, right? Yeah, so lots of connections there, but just trying to sort of pull some threads between what various questions and comments that were coming up.
It's wonderful.
Margaretha, there's a couple things there that I really loved. That this idea of service being an underappreciated aspect of relationality, and and I think we can look at the capitalist the sort of marginalization of service, but to take it even beyond that, I mean, there's the whole question of agency, right? So are you a draft animal, or are you a service animal, which that could imply a degree of collaboration, right? Where you're being with, right? So as animals ourselves, the idea of being of service and being with and being intersubjective, right? So if you, for example, a guide dog for someone who has sight impairment, the guide dog is of service, but the guide dog also has to have an intersubjective relationship with their companion, because they have to see what the companion is not able to see, and think of what is important to the companion. So there has to be a degree of being with an intersubjective behavior there. So guide dogs are really interesting. I mean, on the one hand, yes, in this sort of capitalist idea, they're property, but on the other hand, they're much more than that. Like our human companions and our non-human companions, the line between service and labor is very very squiggly and very hard to parse. So if the thing has agency, if the thing, I shouldn't say that, the entity, the collaborator has agency, then it's of service. But if it's just, if you're just, loading some other self down with labor that it has no agency over, then it becomes, burdened or exploited. So I love those other possibilities outside of the labor context, and that's where I think we can really make a difference. How can we be of service to the opossum? And I love the way that Ciclón was taking care of the possums orphans, and that was service. That wasn't, you didn't have to do that, nobody was paying you. That was because you were being with it, and the sense of compassion and care is service that we need to do more of as sentient beings. Like, so I like to kind of parse that delineation a little bit.
I really love the guide service animal example, because it's a wonderful, the necessary intersubjectivity that is, and communication that's required to actually complete the tasks that a guide, let's say a guide dog, or for just as one of many examples, performs. That's actually wonderful proof, empirical evidence of other minds, and philosophy of other minds can actually be read from the fact that the service animal cannot perform the function if it does not have a conception of other minds that it is making assumptions about and acting on behalf of, and not understanding this. It would not be possible for service animals to do what they do. And so it's a wonderful example, actually, of other minds in action, not coming from the human side.
So the idea of the service animal, I've been working with this for a while. It came from the rehabilitation work, but there was a different twist that happened recently, and it was through my work as an interpreter of language. And I would say like translation is one of the technologies that I'm definitely considering as a technology of consciousness throughout this entire, process. So there was an interpreter. She had worked for, very famous heads of state, and she was a conference interpreter, had worked with, all the presidents. And she was talking about what it is. She was looking for a metaphor to describe what interpreters do, right? And I've heard many, working as an interpreter, I've heard many. I've been called a parrot. I've been called a machine. I've been called a portable dictionary. So, interesting for her to add this different metaphor to the list. And so she said, she was trying to find it. She said, we're like service dogs. That's what we're doing for these, presidents. We're letting them participate in the conversation. I won't cite her name because I think she would be mortified at the fact that I'm spreading this, behind the scenes translation of hers, of what it is that we do as interpreters, because obviously the people who want to accept that they're not able would be not presidents, right? Like presidents are the ones who want to be the most able in terms of how they present themselves to the world. Putin, doesn't want to think that he needs a service dog, right? Probably. So, or a service translator, right? That they're not capable in the same way. But then there's also the discomfort for the interpreter of being compared to an animal, right? Like, no, we're these savvy beings who have all this education and languages. Of course, we're not a dog, like, so there's this, I got this tension when I pulled that metaphor from her and I started using it, both from the interpreters who did not think that it was sexy to be compared to a service dog, and also from the potential clients that I might have who don't want to think of themselves as crip, right? But so that's something that I'm thinking with too. But I think that the other question is, having been someone who has gone through the training with multiple dogs to enable them to have the service animal label, there's also an interesting part when their body breaks down, right? When we think about time and how our companions have different lifespans, right? Like, so Oliver, you have the problem of having a turtle who may live longer than you. When we have the smaller mammals, we have the problem that we know that their death is going to come before our death comes usually, right? And so we have these different lifespans that we're working with. And I think that for me, watching Luke go from service animal who helped us to confront a series of things, from depression to, aggression in institutional spaces, etc. Like he was very much a service animal in that way for us. But when we saw him get sick, it was like suddenly the roles changed, right? Suddenly we had to take on the role of service animal for him to vie for his interests in the face of the institutional, the hospital and their type of control of his body. And it's what happened with the bear, right? When I'm thinking about Lyme disease, I'm almost positive, like I'm watching Matzia go through Lyme and I'm giving her supplements that are included in this Stephen Buhner book, which is why I cited it, because I really want the chemistry, the biochemistry of the plants to inform the world that I'm trying to create around me in that circle that I mentioned. I can't help but wonder about the pain of the bear with the Lyme. Like, what happens to them? What happens to these edge creatures? Like, how can we be in service? And I think that there's this really huge schism between public health and the way that they understand these creatures, because it's always anthropo-supremacist in their mindset. And so that's where the service animal is coming from for me. Like, how do we perform? And it's for humans too, right? Like the BIPOC label is a service animal label, right? It's to advance the rights of those who have been rendered inhuman in racial, gendered, ableist capitalism, right? So you know, I just feel like that reciprocity needs to just be consistent. Like we constantly have to be learning how to be of service without forgetting, as my intellectual friend Kelly Gowell mentions, that cheap care is real too, you know, and that often the care that we offer becomes this burden where we end up suffering compassion fatigue. So it's like, I think that the point is we need to have a network of care because we can't take it all upon ourselves. And that network can't just be in the traditional model of the heteronormative family, because that model we know reproduces that cheap care.
Yay, queer kinship. Speaking of networks of care and queer kinship, and also that we're all coming up very soon on being 30 minutes over time, and I don't want to end this wonderful conversation, but speaking of multi-species care and services of care, my struggles to give this little man who has kidney disease, subcutaneous fluids, partly has to do with the difficulty of administering the service of care, of sticking a needle in his floppy skin on his back and giving him 150 milliliters of lactated ringer solution so that he doesn't die each day. Not having a community that can assist me with extra hands to hold him gently while I insert the needle in the tape. It's true, it's so much of our ability to care is stymied by neoliberal isolation, right? And so I think maybe one great way to sort of leave this super fruitful possible conversation, as Goonie tells me, Mom, I need my fluids. I need them now. And then actually runs away because he doesn't want the needle, is to say, what can we do as the next steps from this conversation in becoming service animals to one another? And service not in the service of capitalism, but service, as Vanya pointed out, that's not monetized and monetizable, but that instead creates an ethos of kinship, of odd kin, non-biogenetic, maybe non-species bounded kinship for the end of this most destructive form of world making, one that can usher in and build and create the foundations organizationally, relationally, in terms of our quotidian, everyday lived shared lives. What kind of communities of care and kinship, modes of kinship, can becoming service animals to one another and to other beings, even ones that we don't particularly like. How can that ethos be enacted? What are our next steps? I think maybe if I would like the audience to be left with I like it when audiences are left hungry for still more at the end of a talk, left with questions that they want a whole nother talk to address, which I hope we'll have. I would like it if each one of you out there can think about yourself as a service animal and ask what and who and in what ways are you capable of serving? What greater good do you want to serve? What kind of function would your taking on some role of being a service animal, living in the service of building a better, different world? What would that look like in your everyday normal practices of life? What kinds of small acts of kindness and paying attention would that entail? Ask yourself, look around you. What and who needs care and service? How can you be of service and serve something bigger than yourself and something less exploitative and disgusting than neoliberal global capitalism and the many lists of other things that all the other isms that go along with it. If there are any final thoughts that each of you would like to maybe leave us with, I don't think this conversation can really ever be finished, but if there's any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with before we have to sort of end, so Goonies kidneys can get some fluid, I'd love to just hear from each of you one more time.
Don't forget to be a service animal to yourself too.
Yeah, I love that. I just have gratitude. Thank you so much for bringing me in and and for being in discussion.
Likewise, I'm so grateful for the discussion and just, you know, I mean, just hanging out with your non-human pals. I mean, I just think it's so important. We have so much to share. You know, these little guys, these little slime molds, I mean, the little entity, you know, it's interesting. Something as simple as that can teach you so much. And I think we start to care about each other. We have this interaction of mutual, you know, exchange that I think is quite productive. And so anything, the simplest thing can provide a rich relational opportunity. And I think we should constantly, you know, be open to these relational opportunities that all of the other selves are constantly offering us, and without it being an exploitative thing, looking for these opportunities to have service, I think for us to the other selves, I think is vital. So thanks for this rich conversation and much appreciated. I hope we do get to continue at some point.
Let's do it. Let's just do it. I mean, all we have to do is pick a time and pick a theme. Ciclón, do you have any thoughts you want to finally share with us at the end of all of this?
I know I would just say, you know, I don't want to take any more time away from Goonie and his needs and his medical care. And I will say this, for those of you who are interested in learning more about how to become service animals to the wildlife, you know, there's some really interesting, like going beyond the academic conference was really important for me. For example, I started going to wildlife rehabilitation conferences. I try to go once per year, and I learned so much valuable information from these teachers. And I don't agree with them all the time about their ideas about, you know, who gets to stay alive, but I think they have really important mechanisms for teaching us how to respond, how to become response able. So I would just say that that's like, if you're interested in this, you know, seek out these types of spaces where you can learn how to have a good reaction, because most of the time we're so stressed in the moment that the body breaks down that we don't know what to do. So we need to learn so that we have that reaction ready for when it does happen.
When you said response able that way, I know all of my students, their ears perked up, right? Because of course we've been talking about what response-ability means all semester. They've encountered a little bit from Donna Haraway, but actually one of the formulas of responsibility that we have discussed quite a bit in my class, my theory class with my wonderful master's students this semester, is what Karen Barad says about queering responsibility. When she says it's not just about doing the right thing. It's not just about, you know, the right appropriate ethical action towards others, but actually, more importantly, queering responsibility is about creating a space, an openness for the maybe unexpected responses of others that you would encounter and deal with. And I would like to just submit, maybe as a closing thought, that being open to the responses and the calls and the instructions and the teachings of other beings around me is probably the most important source of lessons about how to become the kind of human that I would like to say deserves to continue to exist on this planet. I don't know if I want to abolish the human. I think that's a flattening that is as problematic as the Anthropocene is made by all humans, but certainly Anthropos, that historical being, has done a lot of damage. I wouldn't mind abolition of Anthropos, but as we try to figure out what it might mean to be an animal called the human a better way than we have been in recent times, maybe we can look to our more than human teachers to show us how, give us opportunities, not just to think navel gaze about what it means to be a better human, but to enact them in very specific practices of care and service and kindness. So in the spirit of that, I will go, in fact, and offer the kindness of subcutaneous fluids with a needle that my cat does not find kind and fights me on, but needs to stay alive. And I want to thank you all for the beautiful insights and wonderful understandings that you brought to this conversation and shared with all of us, with our community here. We're still growing together. And I mean very seriously that I would love for this conversation to continue. So let's just actively find a way where the next step in this conversation can happen. Okay, we for all of you folks out in the audience, some of you are already subscribed to our YouTube channel. I put it in the chat. Same thing with our Facebook page. It's one easy way to get this information. And we are now putting together a series of talks that are related to the Indigenous and More Than Human Ecological Justice workshop that AMOR MUNDI Lab is doing with RCSD and ICHI here at Tsinghua University for a bunch of different participants, some of whom are students and some of whom are already emerging young scholars. And we are going to have a sort of a roundtable symposium about indigeneity, water as a relational being, rivers as persons, and more than human agency that will involve indigenous ideas, indigenous thought from some indigenous thinkers or people who work with indigenous people in Southeast Asia and the North American context. So I'll keep you posted on that, but it's probably going to be around the 20th. I'm guessing 20th or 21st of September. So keep you all posted. Thank you everyone again so much for all of your thoughtful comments. And I hope that this conversation continues very soon. With love of the world, AMOR MUNDI to you. Let's love this world better. Good night, everybody. Good morning to some of you. Take care of each other. Thank you.